When a country's leadership disappears in a single night, history typically records it as change. What happened in Iran's airspace on February 28, 2026, was a scenario some analysts had been modeling theoretically for decades. Calculations, strategy documents, probability assessments, all waiting on shelves. Some historians ask, if a conflict is planned long enough, does it eventually become inevitable? That question for now remains unanswered. Section 1. How the system emerged. The 1979 revolution in Iran signaled not only the end of a government, but the collapse of an entire geopolitical order. Until that point, the balance across the Middle East had been constructed on specific alliance structures, pro-Western regimes, oil flows, regional power equilibrium. All of it began to be redefined the moment the Shah fell from power. Some scholars of international relations identify 1979 as one of the most decisive rupture points in modern Middle Eastern history. According to this view, from that year forward, the relationship between Tehran and Washington was never able to develop into anything resembling a normal state-to-state relationship. The hostage crisis, sanction regimes, proxy conflicts, each one quietly laying the infrastructure for the next. According to certain records during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, the balance of power in the region was actively shaped by more than one external actor. The extent to which each side was supported and by whom remains a matter of debate among historians. But what that period left behind is not disputed. Iran began viewing the systems surrounding it with a permanent structural distrust. Some analysts argue that Iran's nuclear activities can be read not only as a weaponization strategy, but equally as a bargaining chip. The further the program advanced, the more valuable it became. The nuclear program carries a different dimension. Some analysts argue that Iran's nuclear activities can be read not only as a weaponization strategy, but also as a negotiating tool. Under this interpretation, the program grew more valuable the further it advanced, both internally, as a source of legitimacy, and externally, as leverage. Whether this reading is accurate remains contested, but the observable pattern, negotiations collapsing at the same point, repeatedly, formed a legible cycle. Section 2. How the system actually worked. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA signed in 2015, was designed as a multilateral mechanism to break this cycle. The core logic of the agreement was straightforward. Iran restricts its nuclear activities. In return, sanctions are lifted. Some international law academics argue that such agreements are not merely technical arrangements, but institutional expressions of trust building. The United States' withdrawal from the agreement in 2018 was recorded as a defining moment in the mechanism's collapse. Many analysts interpret the downstream effects on regional dynamics in different ways. One school of thought holds that the withdrawal cornered Iran and made returning to the negotiating table significantly harder. Another maintains that the agreement contains structural flaws from the outset, and its collapse was always a matter of when, not if. The tension between these two interpretations sits at the center of any honest attempt to understand the road to 2026. After 2019, events in the region accelerated. The activation of Iranian-backed groups, direct and indirect confrontations between Israel and Iran, tensions in the Gulf, all of it functioned as interconnected parts of a single system. Some security analysts suggest this period represented a systematic progression toward what both sides defined as an irreversible threshold. Exactly where that threshold was drawn remains a matter of active debate. The October 7, 2023, Hamas attacks on Israel and the ensuing Gaza war marked a moment of restructuring for this system. According to some regional security experts, this process simultaneously exposed both the capacity and the fragility of Iran's proxy network, the degradation of Hezbollah in Lebanon, the losses sustained by Hamas in Gaza. Certain analysts argue these developments significantly narrowed Iran's strategic position. Section 3. How consequences spread. By late 2025, a different pressure mechanism had activated within Iran itself. The collapse of the ruble, economic crisis, and the rising cost of living triggered what became the largest nationwide protests in the country's history since 1979. Some political scientists argue that these protests constituted a rare example of the interaction between external pressure and internal dynamics reaching a simultaneous breaking point. The state's posture toward protesters reverberated widely across international platforms. According to certain sources, the most violent suppression events of January 2026 directly shaped both Western government rhetoric and the internal assessments of the U.S. administration. At this juncture, how thin the line between diplomatic and military calculation had become was an observation several analysts were compelled to make. In February 2026, the negotiation process reached an impasse once more. According to some accounts, U.S. demands, including a complete halt to all Iranian nuclear enrichment activity, moved beyond any framework that could reasonably be described as negotiable. The nature of the internal legitimacy crisis Iran would face if it accepted such terms is identified by one school of thought as the root cause of the breakdown. The operation launched on February 28, 2026, represented what more than one analyst has described as a strategic experiment in regime change through air power alone. The operation launched on February 28, 2026, represented what more than one analyst has described as a strategic experiment in regime change through air power alone. Historical precedents offer divergent lessons about the outcomes of such strategies. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya each carried its own distinct conditions. The extent to which comparisons hold continues to be debated in academic circles. Iran's counterstrike did not slow. 27 U.S. military bases across the region were targeted. Ballistic missiles were launched toward Israel. Facilities in Gulf states were struck. By the fifth day of the conflict, the number of actors drawn into the regional system had begun to grow. Turkey's NATO defense systems were activated. Jordan closed its airspace. Civilian casualties were reported in Kuwait. For some analysts, this picture illustrates how quickly the concept of a limited operation can lose its meaning. Section 4. What the present reflects. Historians have long examined why certain conflicts produce unforeseen outcomes. One possible interpretation is this: when systems grow sufficiently complex, the intent of any single actor ceases to determine the result. Decades of accumulated decisions, reactions, miscalculations, and countermoves, their sum generates an output that no party fully anticipated. Whether the events of February 2026 fit this pattern is a question that historical scholarship will be working to answer for years. What is observable in the present? Regional oil flows have been disrupted. The IAEA's official statement on the condition of Iran's nuclear facilities preserves its ambiguity. The question of how the political vacuum in Tehran will be filled has no answer, and the effect of these uncertainties on global economic indicators has not yet been fully priced in. Some international relations academics draw attention to the precedent effect of such operations. According to this view, when military options are pursued following a negotiation breakdown, the ground on which future diplomatic efforts rest is fundamentally altered. The question of which state, under which conditions, will be willing to sit at a negotiating table, that question acquires a different weight in the shadow of this precedent. In a period when the energy infrastructure of the Middle East is so deeply entangled with the global economy, the radius of a regional conflict is not bounded by geography alone. The extent to which this interconnectedness was understood, and whether it shaped the decisions that were made, remains a contested question. History marks certain moments as points of origin. Looking back, they appear almost inevitable. Yet at the moment they occurred, there were intersections, many of them where a different direction was still possible. Whether February 28, 2026 was such a moment, or the inevitable consequence of decisions made decades earlier, some analysts will argue the second, others the first. That debate had already begun while the events themselves were still unfolding. One thing is legible. In these kinds of ruptures, the parties who calculate the consequences least tend to overlap with the parties who feel those consequences most deeply. This observation is not specific to the Middle East, but it has been recorded repeatedly in this geography. As the smoke over Tehran begins to thin, whether new power structures will form remains unknown. History will answer that question, but when and at what price, no one knows.